Picture a ticking time bomb. Seriously, just take a second and visualize it.
Oh, I mean, I'm definitely picturing the classic action movie setup, right?
Exactly. You've got the digital red numbers counting down, maybe some dynamite bundled together.
And some incredibly sweaty guy agonizing over whether to cut the red wire or the blue wire.
Right, because we are totally conditioned to think of disaster prevention as this hyperkinetic, cinematic event. It's always a physical struggle where somebody grabs the steering wheel right before the car goes off the cliff.
Yeah, we want our heroes to be jumping away from explosions.
We do.
Hmm.
But what if the deadliest bomb in American medical history wasn't made of wires and explosives at all? What if it was literally just a stack of paperwork sitting on a government desk?
It kind of completely upends our whole definition of heroism, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because, we like our disaster prevention to leave a physical mark. We want to see a dent in the bumper to prove that the crash almost happened.
Sure, we want proof.
But when you step into the world of regulatory bureaucracy or public health, the mechanics of a catastrophe look entirely different. The worst tragedies can happen just because someone casually signed their name on a Tuesday afternoon.
Just a rubber stamp and boom?
Exactly. And conversely, the only way to defuse that kind of bomb is to just sit at a desk, cross your arms, and stubbornly refuse to move.
Which is exactly what we are deconstructing in our deep dive today. So if you've ever felt the crushing weight of a deadline, or maybe you've had a boss leaning over your shoulder demanding you just push something through so everyone can go home, you are going to want to hear this.
It's the ultimate case study in the power of a stubborn no.
It is. We're diving into this phenomenal piece of source material. It's a set of production notes and historical outlines for a retrospective series called Echoes of the Past.
Specifically, their 32nd installment, right?
Yes, the one titled The Woman Who Said No. And it details the anatomy of the worst American medical disaster of the 1960s. Or, I guess more accurately, the disaster that completely failed to happen.
Because history has this major blind spot. It easily remembers its rubble.
Oh, absolutely.
It documents the wreckage perfectly. But it has a remarkably hard time remembering the catastrophes that were successfully averted. Because the end result of perfect prevention is just an empty space.
Just a normal day.
Right, a normal day where nothing goes wrong.
Yeah.
So this source material really forces us to stare at that empty space and recognize the monumental effort it took to keep it empty.
So to understand how a single government reviewer, armed with literally nothing but a typewriter, managed to stop an international pharmaceutical giant, we can't just look at her. We have to look at the trap she walked into.
The system itself.
Yeah, because the system in the United States in 1960 was practically begging for a disaster to happen. Let's look at the Food and Drug Administration at that time. Today, you and I picture the FDA as this sprawling, impenetrable fortress in Maryland.
Right, thousands of scientists, lawyers, clinical trial managers, all of that.
But in the autumn of 1960,
it was startlingly small. I mean, the FDA back then had roughly 7 full-time physicians.
7.
7. Responsible for reviewing every single new drug application submitted in the entire United States.
Wait, I have to pause on that because that is absurd. You couldn't adequately review the safety of the menu items at a regional fast food chain with 7 people.
You really couldn't.
How on earth did they think 7 doctors could evaluate the biochemical interactions of every new drug in the country?
Well, they couldn't. And honestly, that was partly the point, or at least the reality of the legal framework they were stuck with. It wasn't just a staffing issue.
It was structural.
Yeah, it was a structural philosophy born out of a law passed decades earlier, back in 1938. The 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act contained this massive loophole.
The 60-day auto clock.
Exactly, the 60-day auto clock.
This is the paperwork bomb we were talking about earlier. Explain how this auto clock actually functioned in practice.
Okay, so under this 1938 law, when a pharmaceutical company submitted a new drug application, the FDA had exactly 60 days to act on it.
60 days total.
Right. And if those 7 overwhelmed doctors did not find a definitive reason to block the drug, or, honestly, if the paperwork simply sat on a desk buried under other files for 60 days, then on day 61, that drug automatically became legal to sell.
Wow.
It just defaulted to approval.
That seems entirely backward. Why would you design a regulatory system where the calendar is actively working against the safety regulators?
It sounds crazy now.
You're basically telling the pharmaceutical company, look, just submit a mountain of paper, and if you can run out the clock, you win. It's like, imagine a software company forcing a massive foundational update to your phone.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
And they tell the cybersecurity team, look, if you don't find a fatal bug in exactly 60 days, this code goes live to millions of people automatically, no matter what. How do you even fight a system where time is your enemy?
You have to look at the psychology of the era to understand it. In the first half of the 20th century, there was this profound cultural optimism about chemistry and medicine.
Like the post-war boom kind of thing.
Exactly. We were entering the era of miracle drugs, antibiotics, the polio vaccine. The legislative mindset was hyper-focused on not stifling innovation.
They didn't want government red tape delaying life-saving cures.
Precisely. So they placed the burden of action entirely on the understaffed regulatory body. The implicit assumption baked into the law was basically this product is safe unless the government can definitively prove it is dangerous within 2 months.
It's a default to yes mechanism.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying when you're dealing with human biology.
Truly terrifying.
And into the specific high-pressure bureaucratic trap steps a brand new FDA reviewer named Frances Oldham Kelsey.
And she is objectively the absolute worst nightmare for a pharmaceutical company trying to coast on a 60-day auto clock.
Totally. Let's look at her background, because she wasn't just a random hire off the street.
Far from it. She was born in British Columbia in 1914. She held a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Chicago, as well as an MD.
Super credentialed.
Oh, yeah. But her academic credentials are only half the story here. The truly critical element of her background is what she experienced in the late 1930s while she was working as a young researcher.
This was under her mentor, right? E.M.K. Geiling.
Yes, under Dialing. She was deeply involved in investigating the elixir sulfanilamide poisoning.
Now, for the listener who might not be familiar with early 20th century medical disasters, elixir sulfanilamide is one of the darkest chapters in American pharmacology.
It really is.
It was an untested liquid medicine, essentially an antibiotic that was marketed largely for children because it had this sweet raspberry taste. But the active ingredient was dissolved in a solvent called diethylene glycol.
And diethylene glycol is the primary ingredient in antifreeze.
Right. It's literally antifreeze. They were feeding children antifreeze. It killed roughly 100 people in an incredibly agonizing way.
It's awful to even think about.
And Kelsey was part of the scientific team tasked with reverse engineering that disaster.
Right. She had to figure out why these people were dying. She looked at the lab results, she understood the biochemistry of that solvent, and she saw the direct, fatal consequences of a company prioritizing distribution over basic safety testing.
Because they just didn't test it, right?
Exactly. The makers of elixir sulfanilamide didn't test their solvent for human toxicity because, at the time, they weren't legally required to. They just assumed it was safe because it looked and tasted fine.
So by the time Frances Kelsey sits down at her desk at the FDA in September of 1960, she possesses this very specific kind of professional armor.
Yes.
She hasn't just read about theoretical medical risks in a textbook. She spent her formative scientific years staring at the literal bodies of children who died because a corporation assumed a chemical was safe.
And that visceral experience fundamentally alters your relationship with authority and with corporate pressure.
It has to.
When you've seen the aftermath of elixir sulfanilamide, a 60-day corporate timeline simply doesn't intimidate you. A company's profit projections hold absolutely zero weight against your own scientific rigor.
And man, she needs every ounce of that rigor because roughly 1 month into her job, the second application she has ever handed lands on her desk.
Just her second one.
Yeah. The drug is called Kevidon. The active ingredient is thalidomide. And it's submitted by the William S. Merrill Company, which was a subsidiary of the giant Richardson Merrill. And we have to understand the sheer momentum behind this specific application.
Oh, the momentum was massive. Kevidon was not some niche experimental shot in the dark. By the time the paperwork hits Kelsey's desk in 1960, thalidomide is already a massive global blockbuster.
It was everywhere.
It's already being sold in dozens of countries around the world. In places like West Germany, it's virtually a household staple. People literally keep it on their nightstands. It is marketed as a mild, completely safe sedative, like a miracle cure for anxiety, for insomnia. And it was heavily prescribed for morning sickness in pregnant women.
So Richardson Merrill expects this FDA review to be a total formality. They're thinking a brief period of paper shuffling, the 60-day clock quietly runs out, and they unlock the most lucrative pharmaceutical market on Earth.
They were absolutely anticipating a rubber stamp. But instead, they hit a brick wall.
But how does she actually become that brick wall? I mean, this is where the mechanics of her resistance are so fascinating. She can't just say a flat no, right?
She can't.
If she just says, I don't like this, the company can appeal it. Or worse, the 60 days run out while they argue about it. So she reads through the application, this mountain of paperwork for Kevadon, and what she finds is scientifically appalling.
It was incredibly thin on actual rigorous data. When Kelsey reviewed the clinical evidence Merrill provided, she saw that it relied heavily on doctor testimonials rather than controlled double-blind science.
Like anecdotes.
Basically.
Yeah.
The application was full of statements like, I prescribed this to 50 patients and they all slept wonderfully. Or, no immediate side effects were observed in my clinic.
It's literally the 1960s equivalent of a 5-star Yelp review. Like, love the atmosphere, pill went down smooth. That isn't science.
It absolutely isn't science. The foundational data on the drug's chemistry, its absorption rates, its long-term physiological effects, they were shockingly sparse for a chemical compound intended for mass, over-the-counter style distribution.
Right.
So Kelsey uses the bureaucracy's own rules against itself.
Yeah.
What she does is she officially marks the application as insufficient and requests more data.
And that word insufficient is the crucial legal lever, isn't it? What happens to the ticking bomb when she files that specific status?
The 60-day auto clock resets to 0.
I love this part of the source material. It is an absolute masterclass in bureaucratic judo.
That's a perfect way to put it.
She doesn't have to definitively prove the drug is dangerous on day 59 to stop it. She just has to point to a hole in the data and say, your homework is incomplete. Try again. And suddenly, the burden of action shifts entirely back to the pharmaceutical company.
And you can imagine that shift triggers an immense pressure campaign.
Yeah.
You really have to picture the frustration at Merrill. They have a drug generating massive profits globally, and it's being held up by a mid-level civil servant who just keeps asking for more paperwork.
So what do?
They start calling her. And these weren't polite check-ins. By some accounts in the notes, they called her more than 50 times over the course of this ordeal.
50 phone calls from angry corporate executives. That is psychological warfare.
It really is. And they visited her office in person. They sent representatives all the way to Washington to lean on her. And when she politely but stubbornly refused to clear the drug, they did what powerful entities always do. They went over her head.
Of course they did.
They began complaining directly to her superiors at the FDA. They were labeling Kelsey an obstructionist, calling her a fussy bureaucrat who was needlessly withholding a miracle drug from the American public.
Think about the sheer mental toll of that. Most people in any profession facing that level of sustained harassment from a major corporation while being told by the rest of the world that the product is perfectly fine would eventually just sign the paper to make the phone stop ringing.
Oh, absolutely.
You'd second-guess yourself. You'd think, maybe I'm being too rigid. Everyone else says it's safe.
But she doesn't break. And crucially, her bosses at the FDA didn't break either.
That's a huge point.
It is. Despite the intense lobbying from Merrill, Kelsey's superiors backed her up. They trusted her scientific assessment over the corporate timeline. If her department heads had caved to the political or corporate pressure, her resistance wouldn't have mattered at all.
So they are locked in this grinding standoff. She bounces the application back, resetting the clock, tick, 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 a reset. But to keep doing this legally, she needs genuine scientific leverage. She can't just keep asking about, the font size on the application. She needs a real reason. And in December of 1960, she gets the thread she needs to unravel the whole thing.
A small but critical signal emerges from Europe. A letter is published in the British Medical Journal that casually links long-term thalidomide use to peripheral neuritis in adults.
Okay, let's break down the biology of that. What is peripheral neuritis, and why did that specific condition set off alarm bells for a pharmacologist like Kelsey?
So peripheral neuritis involves damage to the peripheral nervous system, specifically the nerves in the extremities, the hands and the feet. Adults who were taking thalidomide in Europe were reporting tingling, numbness, and severe pain in their limbs.
Like nerve damage.
Exactly. And from a pharmacological standpoint, this is a massive red flag. It indicates that the drug isn't just passing harmlessly through the digestive tract and putting the brain to sleep. It is actively, chemically interfering with the nervous system.
Which is not what a mild sedative should do.
Not at all. And worse, reports suggested the nerve damage wasn't always temporary. Sometimes it was permanent.
So Kelsey reads this letter, and she applies a brilliantly terrifying logic to it. She looks at Merrill and says, If this drug is toxic enough to permanently damage the fully developed nervous system of a grown adult, what on earth does it do to a developing fetus?
And that question became the impenetrable wall she built around the American public. She asked Merrill directly, does thalidomide cross the placenta?
And why was that such a disruptive question in 1960? Like, why wouldn't they already know that?
Because of the prevailing medical dogma of the time. In the mid-20th century, many doctors and researchers operated under the assumption that the placental barrier was a near-perfect shield.
Really?
Yeah, they believed that the mother's body naturally filtered out harmful chemicals, protecting the fetus from the vast majority of medications. It was this paternalistic, almost mythical view of maternal biology.
But Kelsey, with her background in pharmacology, knew better than to trust an unproven assumption. A biological barrier is still just a membrane, right? It depends entirely on the molecular weight and the lipid solubility of the specific chemical compound.
Precisely. She demanded data on placental transfer. And Merrill couldn't provide it because they hadn't rigorously tested for it.
But our source material highlights a deeply unsettling footnote here. There is a buried signal that they might have had some idea.
Yes. The production notes mention that Merrill reportedly had seen indications of birth defects in their internal animal testing, but they did not flag those anomalies in their application to the FDA.
Wow.
Now, whether that was due to genuine oversight, a failure to understand the data, or deliberate suppression, the end result was the same. The data on fetal safety was not presented to Frances Kelsey.
So she just tells him to go back to the lab and prove it doesn't cross the placenta. And this is the brilliance of her strategy. She didn't have to definitively prove Kavada was dangerous to unborn children. She just had to hold her ground and demand that the company prove it was safe.
Right. It's what the source refers to as the courage of quiet, stubborn scruple.
Quiet, stubborn scruple. I love that.
There were no dramatic speeches in Congress, just 19 months of sitting at a desk saying, please provide the data.
But while Frances Kelsey is managing to literally pause time in the United States, we have to look outward because her standoff only protected one country. The 60-day clocks in the rest of the world had long since run out.
Right.
What happens when a flawed global consensus meets cold biological reality? If a drug bypasses these paper walls and enters a massive population, how does the truth finally surface? To see that, we have to travel away from Washington, D.C., and look at how this unfolded globally.
By 1961, the disaster that Kelsey feared was already happening. But it wasn't immediately recognized as a unified global event. It was actually spotted independently in two different hemispheres by medical professionals who were just paying really close attention to their local communities.
Let's start in Australia, because the discovery there didn't start with a high-level research scientist. It started with a frontline healthcare worker.
It did. It started with a midwife named Sister Pat Sparrow. She was delivering babies and began noticing a sudden, highly unusual spike in a very specific, very rare congenital condition among the newborns.
She just saw the pattern firsthand.
Exactly. And she voiced her suspicions to an obstetrician she worked with, Dr. William McBride.
The condition they were observing is called phocomelia. Can you explain the biological mechanism behind this? Like, what exactly was happening in the womb?
Phocomelia is an extremely rare condition that severely affects the formation of limbs during gestation. Children were being born with foreshortened arms and legs, or sometimes with their hands and feet attached directly to the trunk of the body.
It's devastating.
It is. And to understand how thalidomide caused this, we have to look at what Kelsey suspected. It did cross the placenta.
And once it crossed the placenta, what did the chemical actually do?
Well, modern science now understands that thalidomide is a powerful inhibitor of angiogenesis.
Angiogenesis.
Yes, which is the growth of new blood vessels. Think of a developing fetus, like a city being built from scratch. The body has to lay down a massive highway system of blood vessels to supply nutrients to the growing limbs.
So it's like a roadblock on a developing highway. The body is trying to build an arm, laying down the infrastructure, and thalidomide essentially throws up a concrete barrier.
That's a highly accurate way to visualize it. And the timing is devastatingly precise. If a pregnant woman took even a single dose of thalidomide during a highly specific window, between days 20 and 36 after fertilization, which is the exact moment the embryonic limb buds are forming, the drug starved those developing limbs of the blood vessel networks they needed to grow.
Just starve them.
Right. Everything past that biochemical roadblock simply couldn't be built.
One single dose on day 24, taken just to help the mother sleep or relieve morning sickness, permanently altered the child's body. That is chilling.
It's horrifying.
And McBride in Australia starts tracing the medical histories of these mothers and realizes they all took thalidomide. But he wasn't the only one connecting the dots, right?
No, he wasn't. Independently, over in West Germany, a pediatrician named Wittikind Lenz began seeing the exact same tragic pattern. He was confronting a sudden epidemic of phocomelia in his clinics, and he also meticulously traced it back to thalidomide use in early pregnancy.
So you have McBride in Australia and Lenz in Germany, both looking at their data, realizing the entire global medical consensus is completely wrong. That takes a massive amount of professional courage to stand up and say, hey, this blockbuster drug that everyone loves is actually a teratogen causing catastrophic harm.
It really does. Lenz formally presented his overwhelming evidence at a medical conference in November of 1961. And the global reaction, once the data was out there and undeniable, was incredibly swift. Within weeks, the drug was rapidly pulled from shelves across Europe and eventually globally.
But the damage was already done. The sheer scale of this systemic failure is difficult to even comprehend.
It is massive. We are looking at roughly 10,000 children across 46 different countries who were born with thalidomide-related differences. And honestly, that number doesn't even fully capture the thousands of undocumented miscarriages and pregnancy losses caused by the drug's toxicity.
I want to pause here for a moment because our source material for this deep dive includes a very specific and vital directive about how we discuss this.
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up.
We are talking about a historical failure of regulation, but the people impacted by this failure are living adults today. The thalidomide survivors are athletes, they are musicians, activists, professionals. Their lives are full and complex. The horror we are analyzing today is strictly the scale of the bureaucratic and systemic failure.
Exactly.
We are dissecting a system that valued corporate speed over biological safety. We are not physically cataloging individuals. We are holding a failed global regulatory apparatus accountable.
That is an essential distinction. The tragedy is rooted in the fact that this massive outcome was entirely preventable with proper scientific rigor. The global disaster serves as this deeply somber vindication of Frances Kelsey's central, unanswered question.
She asked about the placenta.
She asked about the placenta, she asked for the data, and tragically the rest of the world ended up providing the horrific data she was demanding.
It really does make you wonder, though, about the fragility of the entire process. What if that British medical journal letter about the nerve damage in adults had never been published? What if that European doctor had just kept those observations to himself?
It's a scary thought.
Would Kelsey have had the scientific leverage to keep resetting her 60-day clock? I mean, she was brilliant enough to bounce the application back initially because the trial data was flimsy, but that BMJ letter gave her the specific, undeniable weapon she needed to demand fetal safety data.
It's deeply concerning when you view it as a systemic design. A robust national regulatory framework shouldn't have to rely on a serendipitous letter published in a foreign medical journal to catch a catastrophic danger.
No, it sure.
The requirement to prove comprehensive safety should have been built into the foundation of the process itself, not discovered through ad hoc detective work by one reviewer.
Which brings us back to the United States. We want to believe this story has a perfect, clean victory for America. We love the narrative that Frances Kelsey stood her ground, built a wall of paperwork, and the United States was completely shielded from this disaster. A perfect zero.
It's a great story.
But the source material forces us to look closer. That isn't entirely true, is it?
No, sadly, it is not a perfect zero. The 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the same law that created the dangerous 60-day auto-approval clock, contained another massive crack in its armor.
Oh, no.
A loophole that was, by any modern standard, almost unbelievably reckless.
The investigational sample loophole. How did this function legally? Because it sounds like a massive contradiction.
It was a huge contradiction. Under the law at that time, pharmaceutical companies were legally allowed to hand out investigational samples of a brand new drug to physicians freely, supposedly to gather clinical experience, before the drug was ever officially approved by the FDA for commercial sale.
Wait, so while Frances Kelsey is sitting in her office in Washington, D.C., successfully holding up the official commercial approval of Kevadon by resetting the clock and demanding safety data, Richardson Merrill is just handing the drug out to doctors anyway.
Yes. Taking full advantage of that loophole, Merrill distributed these pre-approval, highly experimental samples of Kevadon to over 1,000 doctors across the United States.
1,000 doctors?
And those doctors, in turn, gave the pills to roughly 20,000 patients, all under the guise of an investigational rollout.
That completely bypasses the gatekeepers. It's like finding out that while the cybersecurity team was successfully blocking the official release of that buggy software update we talked about, the developers were just quietly emailing beta versions to 20,000 end users to see how it runs on their phones.
It's exactly like that.
It nullifies the entire point of having an FDA review process.
It essentially created a shadow distribution network. And because of this unregulated shadow rollout, the protective shield Kelsey built wasn't perfect. The FDA eventually identified about 17 American cases of thalidomide-affected births.
17 American families whose lives were permanently altered because a pharmaceutical company could legally hand out experimental pills like candy. And this brings up a massive historical and ethical question. How could doctors just hand unapproved drugs to pregnant women?
It requires looking at the medical paternalism of the 1960s.
Okay, what does that mean?
The culture of medicine at the time was very much the doctor knows best. Patients generally didn't ask questions about what they were being prescribed, and doctors didn't feel obligated to explain the regulatory status of a pill.
So these doctors were acting as unwitting, unpaid distributors for an unapproved experimental drug.
Exactly.
And they were handing it to pregnant patients to treat morning sickness without ever telling the patients, hey, this is an investigational chemical that the FDA hasn't cleared yet. The patients were essentially enrolled in an unregulated clinical trial without their knowledge.
It was an ethical nightmare that was completely legal at the time. The patients had no explicit informed consent.
Which complicates the narrative we like to tell, doesn't it? We love the lone hero myth. We want Frances Kelsey to have single-handedly saved the entire country with her typewriter. And she was the decisive, unyielding gatekeeper, absolutely. But she wasn't alone, and she wasn't omnipotent against a flawed system.
The lone hero narrative is almost always a simplification of history. She was part of a collective effort of principled scientists working against deeply flawed legislation.
Right.
She relied heavily on colleagues at the FDA to help analyze the flimsy data Merrill provided. She also relied on outside experts, like a prominent American cardiologist named Dr. Helen Taussig.
What does she do?
She actually traveled to Europe to investigate the thalidomide link firsthand and brought crucial testimony back to the U.S. And ultimately, Kelsey relied on the hard, tragic data compiled by Lenz and McBride.
So we have this massive averted catastrophe, mostly averted anyway, save for the tragic impact of the shadow rollout. But here is the profound political problem. A disaster that leaves no widespread rubble, no collapsed buildings, and no smoke in the sky is inherently invisible.
Yes.
If the system technically worked, if Kelsey stopped the widespread commercial release, how do you convince the United States Congress to completely rewrite the laws based on something that didn't happen?
The invisibility problem is one of the hardest hurdles in public health policy. If the bomb doesn't go off, people don't panic. And for a long time, Kelsey's 19-month standoff with Merrill remained completely unknown to the American public.
She was just doing her job.
Right, she was just a dedicated bureaucrat who had done her job well in silence. It took the power of journalism to make the invisible danger visible.
Enter a journalist named Morton Mintz. In July of 1962, he broke the entire story in the Washington Post. He laid everything out for the public: the offense corporate pressure, the absurdity of the 60-day auto clock, the devastating global tragedy unfolding in Europe and Australia, and the lone woman in Washington who stood in the gap to protect America.
And the public reaction to Mintz's reporting was explosive. Once the American public realized exactly how close they had come to a nationwide medical catastrophe and how absurd and flimsy the current laws were, the political momentum for change became unstoppable.
It was a wake-up call.
A huge one. The visibility Mintz provided led directly to national recognition. In August 1962, President John F. Kennedy awarded Frances Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service.
Which is an incredibly high honor. She was only the second woman in history to receive it. But the medal wasn't the real victory, was it?
No, the true victory was legislative. The massive public outcry generated by the story provided the momentum to finally fix the broken system. In October 1962, Congress unanimously passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
Okay, let's really dig into this, because this isn't just a minor tweak to a rule book. The source notes emphasize that this fundamentally changed how medicine operates. How did Kefauver-Harris actually disrupt the pharmaceutical business model of the era?
It was a total paradigm shift. First and foremost, it entirely eliminated the automatic 60-day approval clock. The ticking bomb was permanently diffused. A drug could no longer default to the market just because time ran out.
So the FDA was no longer racing the calendar. What else changed?
Crucially, It mandated that a drug must be proven not just safe, but effective before it goes to market.
Wait, they didn't have to prove it was effective before.
Nope. Prior to this, you essentially just had to prove your compound didn't outright kill people. Now you had to prove through rigorous, controlled clinical trials that the drug actually did what your marketing claimed it did.
So those 1960s doctor testimonials, I gave this to 50 patients and they felt great, were no longer legally viable proof.
Exactly. The burden of proof legally shifted entirely onto the pharmaceutical companies. This meant years of rigorous trials, massive financial investments in research, and definitive statistical data.
That's a huge change.
It is. Furthermore, foreign approval was no longer considered sufficient. Just because a drug was popular and cleared in Europe didn't mean it automatically met FDA standards in the United States.
And what about that massive loophole we discussed, the investigational samples?
That brings us to perhaps the most profound change from medical ethics. The amendments strictly regulated clinical trials and mandated that trial subjects must give informed consent.
Informed consent. You could no longer just hand a pregnant woman an experimental pill without her knowing exactly what it was, that it was unapproved, and what the potential risks might be.
The introduction of mandatory informed consent fundamentally changed the power dynamic and the ethical relationship between doctors, researchers, and the public.
It gave the power back to the patient.
It really did. It codified the idea that a patient has an absolute right to know what is being put into their body during an experiment. Modern medical trials, the rigorous phases of testing we see today, the ethical review boards, all of these foundational guardrails are structured entirely around the lessons learned from this one near miss.
I look at this and I keep coming back to the analogy of the fire inspector. We throw parades for the firefighters who pull people out of burning buildings. We make blockbuster movies about them.
We do.
But we rarely celebrate the fire inspector who quietly points out faulty wiring, writes a boring report, and makes sure the building never catches fire in the first place. Without Morton Mintz breaking that story, Frances Kelsey remains a nameless bureaucrat. The public never knows how close they came to the edge, and maybe those laws never change.
It's the unsung heroism of functional infrastructure.
Bruh.
We only notice it when it fails. When it works perfectly, it looks like a whole lot of nothing is happening.
But history rarely gives us a completely clean black and white ending, does it? There's an honest coda to this story, detailed in the source material, that I think is one of the most surprising and nuanced parts of this entire deep dive. Because the ultimate proof that Frances Kelsey's new system worked wasn't the permanent total banishment of thalidomide from the earth.
That's right. Thalidomide was not banished forever. And this coda raises a really vital question about how we view controversial scientific discoveries. A chemical compound is entirely neutral. It is not inherently evil. It doesn't have malicious intent. The catastrophe of the early 1960s was entirely the result of human hubris, sloppy testing, and bureaucratic loopholes.
The drug didn't fail the system. The human system failed to understand the drug.
Precisely. And decades later, under exactly the kind of strict oversight, rigorous clinical trials, and scientific scrutiny that Kelsey's fight helped establish, thalidomide found a careful, highly controlled second life.
It is actively being used today. How is that even possible?
Researchers eventually discovered that the very mechanisms that made thalidomide so dangerous to a developing fetus, its powerful effects on the immune system, and its ability to inhibit blood vessel formation, could actually be harnessed therapeutically.
Wow.
Today, thalidomide is used to treat severe complications of leprosy, specifically a painful inflammatory condition called erythema nodosum leprosum.
And it didn't stop there, did it? The anti-angiogenesis property, the roadblock on the highway we talked about earlier, turns out to be incredibly useful when you're trying to fight something that relies on rapid blood vessel growth.
Exactly. It became a cornerstone in the treatment of multiple myeloma, a type of blood cancer. Tumors need a massive blood supply to grow. Thalidomide's ability to stop the formation of those blood vessels effectively starves the cancer.
The drug that harmed a generation now actively helps people. It extends lives. But only because someone finally forced the system to slow down and ask the hard biological questions first.
It's a really powerful thought.
It is an incredible irony, but also a beautiful testament to the scientific method. Once it was constrained by proper FDA oversight and modern ethical safeguards, the very same compound that almost broke American medicine became a life-saving tool.
It is the ultimate proof of concept for the Kefauver-Harris amendments. The regulatory system Frances Kelsey helped build was strong enough to safely harness the very danger she prevented. It demonstrates that rigorous regulation doesn't stifle medical advancement. It ensures that the advancement is actually safe, understood, and effective.
So, we've explored how a new FDA reviewer, armed with literally nothing but a typewriter, a calendar, and quiet, stubborn scruple, held off a pharmaceutical giant for 19 months. She dismantled the dangerous 60-day default approval rule. She helped usher in the modern era of patient consent, and she prevented a devastating national tragedy by just holding her ground.
It is a legacy that touches every single person who picks up a prescription bottle today. You trust that medication because of the invisible bureaucratic guardrails she helped install.
And based on all these historical details we've discussed today, the loopholes in the 1938 law, the shadow rollout of experimental drugs, and the sheer invisibility of prevented disasters, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. The Kefauver-Harris amendments finally made it a legal requirement for trial subjects to give consent before taking experimental drugs. Before this near miss, you could be given an investigational sample without even knowing it. Your body could be used to gather corporate data without your permission. Today, we view medical consent as an absolute fundamental right. But it took a disaster that didn't quite happen to guarantee that right in American law.
It fundamentally reshaped the ethics of how we interact with medicine.
So it makes you wonder, going back to that bomb we talked about at the very beginning. We expect disaster prevention to be visible. We expect broken wires and physical struggles. But what other fundamental rights in your daily life only exist right now because someone, decades ago, stubbornly refused to let a ticking clock dictate their actions? What invisible catastrophes are you being protected from right now simply because someone at a desk had the courage to say, "Not yet"? Think about that the next time you are pressured to quickly sign a form.